Good day, class. We've been looking at the growth and administration of Afro-Eurasian Empire so far, which is the major focus of this Unit 3, but I wanted to take a moment to incorporate the Americas into our discussion with the Aztec and Inca empires. This will also be useful as we transition into Unit 4 and begin to analyze the effects of contact between these American empires and the Spanish state and conquistadors. The pre-Columbian Americas are a fascinating place, full of fascinating societies that unfortunately we know too little about. So I also simply want to make sure we introduce some of these elements of these societies in this class. So we will be looking at an Aztec empire and an Incan empire. I will also be using a slideshow from a slightly different presentation, so I might be skipping through certain parts. Pay no heed to that. I will stop and focus on more important things to align to our unit. So first, let's start with the Aztec Empire. So the Aztec Empire exists for about 100 years, from 1428 to 1521. We will talk a little bit about the Mexica people. The Aztec Empire is actually the reference, a name to the empire, and not the actual people of Tenochtitlan, who are known as the Mexica. Right? We'll look a little bit at the city of Tenochtitlan. We will look at this idea of the conquest state and ideology that promotes conquest, which will align very well with Unit 3. And then we might talk a little bit about the economy of the Aztec. Okay, so first off, who were the Mexica people? The Mexica people were actually people who, not too long before they established their city-state of Tenochtitlan, were people from further north of Mexico. They were foreigners to central Mexico who moved in as kind of semi-nomadic hunters and gathering people who took to agriculture within the central Mexican valley and ultimately will settle on an island on this giant lake, Lake Texcoco, around 1300, and this is where they will build their city of Tenochtitlan. Here is a map of the Valley of Mexico. Here you can see Tenochtitlan on this island, and it is surrounded by these other city-states, right? If we remember much of Mesoamerica when we looked at the Maya, but there was other societies too, and they had all of these different smaller city-states. And so one of the things that we will see is Tenochtitlan actually taking and kind of expanding its influence over many of these city-states. And in fact, actually, the initial expansion will not just be Tenochtitlan, but an alliance between Tenochtitlan, Tlacopan, and Texcoco. This map also kind of harkens to some of the great engineering of the Mexica and others. You can see that they were able to build dikes and causeways in the lake to kind of shape the land and also to help promote certain fresh water in what would be otherwise a brackish lake to create these floating gardens known as chinampas. So Tenochtitlan itself was one of the grandest cities in the 16th century and the 15th century before that. People believe that there was easily up to perhaps 200,000 people in Tenochtitlan, making it by far one of the largest cities in the world. When Cortez and the fellow Spanish see the city for the first time, they are completely amazed. It's much larger, cleaner, has fresh running water in these fountains, and is so much more impressive than perhaps any cities that they would have experienced. Monumental architecture, which you could align to our ideas in Unit 3 that we've been talking about, the use of architecture to promote power. These large pyramidal temples would be areas where you'd have major religious rituals, right? Human sacrifice that would be done in this very, profound way that would kind of show the power of the state and those who are performing it. Anyway, so Tenochtitlan was this incredible city. Okay, so let's focus on this idea of the Aztec Empire and its conquest. So, conquest by the Mexica people begins in 1427 with this triple alliance between three city-states, Tenochtitlan, Tlacopan, and Texcoco. we'll talk a little bit more about how this is driven by religion in a second. But ultimately, the empire that is created is a very loosely structured collection of conquered city-states. You do not have this large centralized bureaucracy. It's going to be a decentralized empire. And basically what's going to happen is the Mexica, as they conquer these other city-states, are going to demand tribute. In return for paying that tribute, the Aztec Empire, the Mexica, will allow for those city-states to kind of govern themselves to a certain level. There will be an overseer who makes sure that things are happening in accordance with what the Tenochtitlan ultimately wants, but you will have a larger level of freedom and this kind of decentralized rule. Ultimately, there are about 5 to 6 million people within the Aztec Empire, although actually more recently numbers kind of start to increase more and more as we learn more about the area, right? An interesting thing about the Aztec Empire was it actually allowed for a wide array of social mobility, or maybe I shouldn't say wide array, but for a strong opportunity for social mobility. And it was very much a war-based social hierarchy. At the top, you had an aristocracy, the royal family, these generals of the armies, high government officials, and priests, right? And pretty much government officials were almost always priests as well. Below them, you had what referred to as a warrior nobility. And basically, the warrior nobility was simply soldiers who were so, skilled in war that they were able to capture a certain amount of prisoners of war, right, for those sacrifices. And if you proved yourself to be this capable warrior, you got this special privileged position where you would actually have these serfs who would be given to you, and this land would be given to you, and you would live this, much more luxurious lifestyle. Below the warrior nobility, you had the Pochteka, which were merchants. They were highly valued as well. You'll learn a little bit about why they are valued in an article about religious ritual in the Aztec Empire. And then below them, you would see commoners and workers, and then ultimately the landless workers or serfs, and then slaves below that, who were oftentimes prisoners of war, but could also be perhaps enslaved for other reasons, being, criminals, things like that. So one thing about the Aztec Empire that's particularly interesting is how they used religion to promote conquest. And this will be purely aligned to this idea of the worship of their patron god, Huitzilopochtli. So let's talk a little bit more about this conquest and how religion was connected to it. So the Mexica, like the Maya before them, worshipped multiple gods. In fact, some of the gods that the Maya worshipped and many of the gods that all of these other city-states worshipped were the same gods or similar gods to what the Mexica worshipped, but it was this polytheistic religion. Huitzilopochtli was seen as being the patron god of Tenochtitlan. He was also a god who kind of symbolized the sun, wasn't the sun god himself, but he was the person who was able to provide the power for the sun to rise every day. So here's where things get a little interesting. In 1427, or just before 1427, you have a high priest who is kind of the second in command, so to speak, to the ruler of Tenochtitlan. His name is Tlacaelel. And what he does is, after the Mexica people have been living in Tenochtitlan for a while, he starts to push this belief that the Mexica people have lost their original ways, that living in the central Mexican Valley, they've forgotten their true religious beliefs, things like that. And he emphasizes this idea that Huitzilopochtli really needs human blood to replenish his energy in his battle with darkness, to allow the sun to rise every day. there was already this idea that this human sacrifice was important, but Tlacaelel is going to really push this need for human blood. So what does that do? That means, well, you need more humans for sacrifice. How are you going to get those humans? Through conquest. And not only do you just try to attack a place and get prisoners, but you want to conquer and control that place and bring those people into your fold and perhaps recruit warriors from those people as well. So then you can be more successful in conquering and getting even more people to sacrifice, right? So there's this changing within the religion to promote conquest. A very interesting thing. It's a very clear case of how religion can be utilized in this way. You will see this also being utilized in other empires for conquest, right? This is easily done within the Crusades, within Christianity, and also in Muslim empires. But anyways, another thing that we want to think about though too, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in a Zoom session, but these sacrifices, these were believed to preserve humankind. So why are you doing this? Well, it's because if this does not happen, the world will basically end. Huitzilopochtli will not be able to have the energy to battle darkness and bring the sun forth. And you will have, chaos and end of the world, things like that. So this was seen as being vital. But so here's a great, again, example of how religion is used to promote conquest. So here is just kind of a map showing the expansion of the Aztec Empire. If you pause on this, you can see that the expansion happens very quickly. But another thing that's really important to note when we get to looking at Spanish conquest in this region, there's several different city-states that are not directly under the rule of the Aztec Empire. Also, another thing to note is that the Aztec Empire used a lot of fear and force in terms of its rule over areas, something that many of these city-states weren't very fond of. And they might have been looking, by the time of the Spanish, for allies to help them get out from under Aztec rule. So here's an image of Huitzilopochtli. He was actually supposed to be represented by a blue hummingbird. The Aztec believed, or the Mexica believed, that hummingbirds were these fierce warriors that they would face, beasts hundreds of times their size. And actually, I've been surrounded by hummingbirds lately, and I will say they'll fly right up to your face without any fear. Here is an image of some of that sacrifice. Okay, so in terms of the Aztec, in terms of their economy, it's actually a very interesting economy, very complex marketplaces with all of this trade coming from all over. The Pochteca were these very valued merchant class. But one of the interesting things is they didn't have currency. They didn't have specific money that would be used. And instead, they actually had a very complex barter system with some standardization. So, like lengths of cloth might be something that was regularly used as a standard thing with a standard value that you could trade for other things. And then if those lengths of cloth, didn't quite match up with what you were trying to trade for, whether that be animals or jewelry or whatever it might be, then you could throw in some cocoa beans into it. And so cocoa beans were kind of like your cents, and the lengths of cloth were kind of like your dollars, so to speak, in modern day American currency. Another kind of interesting element about the Aztec Empire, if you remember me talking a little bit a while back about American empires and states, one difficulty of creating these very large societies with dense populations was you didn't have plow-based agriculture. You didn't have domesticated animals. So what you see oftentimes in these areas are these very unique technologies to create this large agricultural growth. And one of the things that you see in the Aztec Empire is this idea of the chinampas, right? These were these floating gardens that they created, which were extremely fertile, being able to perhaps yield 7 crops a year. And so this kind of shows you some diagrams of those chinampas, right? Also here, I note a little bit about the idea of tribute with Tenochtitlan. Oftentimes they're able to get lots of food from other states, right, as part of this large tribute that the city of Tenochtitlan expected from all of these conquered regions. Now let's move on to the Inca Empire. So the Inca Empire is going to be definitely different than the Aztec Empire in a couple of different ways. The Inca Empire was actually much larger, one of the largest empires in the world at this time, easily, with probably 10 million subjects, if not more. So it is going to be larger than the Aztec Empire. It's also going to have a much more sophisticated bureaucracy and administration. It's going to be more centralized than the Aztec Empire. Although some people might argue it's not going to be as centralized as, say, a Song Dynasty China, or a later Ming Dynasty China, or Qing Dynasty China. Their economy will be very interesting, and they'll have this labor system called the Mita that we will definitely talk about now, but come back to later in Unit 4 as well. And we're not going to talk about gender parallelism right now, but that is something that we will see again within the Aztec and the Inca Empire. We talked a little bit about that last time I talked about the Americas. So here we have the Inca Empire. Again, like the Aztec Empire, you can see an empire that expands very quickly over time. And in this case, is going to expand over these huge areas, right? And also this very diverse set of ecosystems, from high alpine areas to tropical rainforest to coastal areas, right? Perhaps one of the most ecologically dynamic empires in the world. These are a couple images of Inca mummies. Religion was actually used to help promote the conquest of other regions. One interesting thing about the Inca Empire was it was believed that when a king or the great Inca passed, all of his possessions, all of his land stayed with him, so that the new king would have to kind of create their own wealth, create their own possessions, create their own land to some degree. So you would conquer more so that you could build up, a name for yourself and wealth and power. Also, these old kings were lavished with gifts, and you actually had things like dinners where old kings, these mummified kings, would be at the table feasting with other people and having conversation with other people. And there'd be people interpreting what the mummies were speaking and things like that as part of this ritual. But that also required huge amounts of goods and wealth and things like that would help promote conquest to get these things. It's not necessarily the same kind of manipulation. It's not necessarily a manipulation like in the Aztec Empire to push forward conquest, but here you do have the use of religion to promote conquest to some degree. Here is just a image of Machu Picchu, a city that is, or possibly a resort for the elite or a religious area. We're not quite sure what it is, but this was a area built 13,000 feet above sea level. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the Inca and think about it in comparison to the Aztec. It's going to be a much larger empire. You do have this greater centralization, as I had said before, and a more elaborate bureaucracy. In both the Aztec and the Inca Empire, you will have very culturally diverse empires. However, within the Inca Empire, you're going to see more of this attempt at unification and assimilation of these culturally diverse peoples. Whereas in the Aztec Empire, there's more of a separation and a rule through fear, which maybe I didn't emphasize when I was talking about the Aztec before. But, they'll be using this element of kind of this increased level of human sacrifice and attacks on these other regions as ways of control and rule over those regions, right? They'll be like, you need to pay us tribute. If you don't, well, we'll come back and we'll attack. It's kind of similar to perhaps the rule of a very early conquering Mongol empire, or the way the Mongols ruled Russia for a while. But these are going to be similar states in terms of the fact that they start out as these smaller city-states and then lead to this very large conquest. And you could also argue that their conquest is motivated by religious beliefs. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the Inca and how they rule over their diverse peoples. So you had a much more of a bureaucracy than you had in the Inca Empire. You had the emperor, and then you had Inca governors under him who ruled over regions, but were close to and closely connected to the emperor. And then you would have local lower level officials. So people who might be helping in the governing, but were actually from the regions that might have been conquered. So you had this trust from the emperor of his Inca governors, but then you also had local lower level officials who might gain the trust of the people who are being ruled over because they're familiar individuals. Another thing that you saw happening in the Inca Empire is that when they conquered regions, one of the things that they might do is they might actually transfer conquered people to new regions. But as they did that, they would let those people maintain their native local authorities just in a new region and with diminished power. So why do they transfer people to new regions? Well, if these people aren't too happy with being conquered, they might rebel. But if these people are moved to a new region where they're unfamiliar with the territory, unfamiliar with the neighbors around them who might not have a common interest, it's going to be more difficult for them to rebel. Now, of course, they would make sure to put these people into a similar ecological setting. You don't want to put coastal people into a tropical rainforest or up in the, Andes, because those people might be fishermen and they can't do that coastal fishing in the tropical rainforest or up on top of a mountain. So that was something that would be taken into account. There was also this attempt to really incorporate people into some sort of kind of common identity. There was this element of assimilation in the Inca Empire. One of the things that the Inca did when they conquered a region is they imposed to a certain level their religion on the people. The people had to incorporate the worship of the sun god into their own religious beliefs. And the emperor was seen to be a descendant of that sun god. So in that way, they're kind of almost worshiping the emperor as well. They also forced the people to learn the language of Quechua, the language of the Inca people. This will be clearly shown in how strong this unity is created, because even in the state of Peru today, there are two official languages. One is Spanish and one is Quechua, right? There's many people in Peru who don't speak Spanish and only speak Quechua. But anyways, even though they're imposing this religion and language on the conquered peoples, they still allow the locals to continue their local religious beliefs, as long as they incorporate that sun god into them. And they will continue to speak their own languages as well. This is actually going to be something important to know when we talk about when the Spanish come in and try to force Christianity on these people. In some ways, that will be something that is not unfamiliar to them, because religions had been forced on conquered peoples in this region before. However, what will be unfamiliar is the fact that the Spanish will expect them to completely do away with all of their own local traditions and religious beliefs. But anyways, moving on, you also see the Inca Empire building these elaborate road systems to be able to develop communication. Here are some of those roads. It's a nice actual rope bridge that has been maintained from the Inca times. Looks like someone's about to climb over it. Anyways, a little bit about the economy and agriculture of the Inca Empire. The economy of the Inca Empire is very interesting because all of the land is owned and controlled by the state. I'm going to kind of move through this relatively quickly, but basically you had these fields, and all of these fields were worked by the people, and some of the products of that work would either go to the temple or, the priests and the religious temples. A quarter of it would go to the emperor. There would be another field that was the Caracas, or to the region, the kind of the immediate region. of those fields, and another one to the people, where the people working those fields, the goods they got, they would give back, they would take for themselves. The state also controlled things like trade and marriage, right? There was no private trading that happened. The state moved all goods on their own. There was no real, marketplaces or things like that. And then also, too, if you were a man of a certain age and you had not found a spouse, they would marry you off to someone. They would choose who your spouse would be. And so what you see that will develop is there's this economy of reciprocity, which we'll talk a little bit about more. But basically, you as a person worked the lands, and you would be insured goods to have in order to survive. So let's talk a little bit more about this idea of the mita system. So basically what happens in this economy is that families who are given land by local authorities, who are given land by the greater state, these families will in turn provide the state with crops and goods, right? The things that they work on those lands, they'll pay back in tribute. But there will also be a tribute in labor that they give back to the state. And this will be referred to as the mita system. And so all of these goods that are created and given back to the state, they will be stored in these giant storehouses throughout the empire, which will be important as we talk about that in just a second. So the mita labor system, right? This is a very unique labor system within the Inca Empire. You can think of it as a labor tax, and we're going to get back to this concept of the system of reciprocity, right? So basically, men from families would be chosen to do labor for the state for a certain number of months. This could be things like military service, maintaining palaces and roads and temples or irrigation systems. You had these post runners who might run up to 100 miles a day on those roads, passing messages. Remember, there's no horses or other animals to speed things along, so these runners were very important. And because they gave this labor to the state and worked for the state would ensure that the families and communities would have the food and shelter and provisions that they needed. So, for instance, if someone in doing this labor died, the state would ensure that widows and children, orphans, would have food and provisions. They would open up their storehouses. In fact, there were storehouses specifically meant for those groups. Or if there was a region that was suffering from a drought or famine of some kind, well, they would open up the storehouses in that region and feed the people, or perhaps bring in food from other regions so that they could feed the people. So there was this kind of system of reciprocity. So it was definitely not a society of equality. You had these extreme elites who controlled things, connected to the emperor and the royal family. But it was a society where there was this idea of kind of ensuring that what people needed was redistributed, right? It's a very interesting society. Sometimes people call it a kind of a proto-socialism, which might make more sense later on when we talk about what socialism is. So one thing that's interesting about the Inca is they don't have a writing system, but they had very intricate accounting that they had to do because of these storehouses and trying to keep track of all of this tribute and what was piling up in these storehouses. And what they did is they created this system of record keeping that we refer to as the quipu, right? And it's a system of corded lengths of string and rope that is knotted as well. We do know that it was used for accounting, but some people think that it actually is truly writing that could possibly even tell a story. This is just a little graphic that tells you a little bit, shows you how it works in terms of numbering things, right? But this is always that curious thing. We don't know that much about the quipu because so much of it was destroyed with Spanish conquest, and also the memory of how to read these was destroyed. But there has been some beliefs that there was actually writing and some perhaps proof that the quipu was used for writing. However, some of those quipu were actually created after Spanish conquest. So the question also becomes, was this something where they took the quipu and adapted it to the writing that they saw from the Spanish, or was this something that they had utilized for writing and not just record keeping earlier? But again, one of these fascinating things about this American society. Okay, in terms of the economy and agriculture of the Inca Empire, one of the things that you see is it's a very diverse ecological area that could have so many different goods. And llama could be raised for food, one of the few domesticated animals there are, or guinea pigs, but all of these other goods that might be utilized and grown in different areas. You also see the use of terracing, which you can see on the right image here, to create fields where otherwise you'd have steep slopes where you couldn't grow crops. Potatoes, right? Potatoes, your potato chips, your French fries, they come from the regions of the Inca Empire originally. You also have this interesting agricultural system, the waru system, that was used in higher regions where you could have freezing temperatures at night. And basically there's a system of of ditches surrounding a field that would be filled with water. And the idea of these ditches is that you might have a day that's, say, 60 degrees, but at nighttime, the temperatures could go below freezing. Your crops freeze, you lose your harvest. So what this water would do is the sun would warm the water throughout the day, which would mean that at night, the crops would stay warm to some degree so that they wouldn't freeze and it would extend growing periods. So this would be kind of like your chinampas. How are they able to create larger agricultural yields to feed these very dense, large populations? Well, the waru would be one of those ways. Okay. We might actually take a look at this excerpt in a future class, but we aren't going to be doing it today. I am not going to be talking about gender parallelism today. I do not think. I can leave it on this slide and you can pause it and take a look. But just kind of a quick little overview. So the Aztec and Inca. Biggest ideas I want to think about, religious ideology is utilized to create pressure for imperialist expansion, especially in the Aztec Empire. That could be an example you use very much within this unit about how religion is used to promote rule. The Inca were a very centralized state with great authority over their subjects, and they had a very intricate state-run trade and exchange system. The Aztec, on the other hand, were much more loosely tied city-states, held together more through fear and violence rather than a centralized bureaucracy. Both, though, had tribute systems that were largely involved in how the government ran things and brought in goods and wealth. In the Aztec world, there was a private trade system with a prominent merchant class, which would differ from the Inca. So this is just kind of a little overview of the Aztec and the Inca. Definitely there's some things about the bureaucracy, the assimilation of people, or the attempts to rule over people through fear, and the use of human sacrifice to promote conquest. These are things that you could definitely use to compare to your major Afro-Eurasian land-based empires of a Manchu Empire or a Russian Empire or an Ottoman Empire or a Mughal Empire. Feel free to do so. We will come back to the Aztec and the Inca, but when we come back to them again, we'll be coming back to them at a time of great trial and horror and terror in terms of what happens within the Columbian Exchange. Until then, take care, and I hope you enjoy your Wednesday. Bye-bye.